Let's go ahead and take a look at the digestive system together. So learning objectives for the entire unit. So we're going to break this into two parts. Part one is in yellow, which is going to be this slideshow, and then part two will be in a second slideshow. But we're going to look at the name, shape, and location of structures of the alimentary tract. We're also going to look at the functions of the alimentary tract and also understand some differences between species in their structure and also in their use of their alimentary tract. We're also going to understand the steps and process of digestion in part two, and then look at mechanical and chemical breakdown of foods. We'll look at the names, shapes, and locations of the digestive tract accessory organs, and then also look at the function of all of those accessory organs in the second slideshow. So what is digestion? So digestion, as you probably already know, is the breakdown of food into usable units to sustain life. So we take in food, us, the guinea pig here, the horse as well, of course dogs and cats take in food, and that food can't be put into our bloodstream until it goes through several different layers of digestion. So the structures and processes differ slightly between species, and I have these two species up on the slide because actually, while they're very different in appearance and size, they're very similar in their GI system. So they actually have a very similar way that they break down and digest their food. Anyway, all animals do have some sort of mechanical and chemical breakdown of the food that they ingest, and we're going to talk a lot about that throughout this unit. There are 5 different types of nutrients, which I believe is a review, right? We know there are carbohydrates or sugars, proteins, fats or lipids, and then vitamins and minerals. You can have them separated out, but I like to just put them together because there are micronutrients. They're both, in that same kind of category. And then of course water, and we all know that water is essential for life and is one of the 5 different types of nutrients. So let's, for simplicity's sake, say we're going to break the digestive system down into 2 different components. We're going to call one part the alimentary canal and the other part accessory organs. Now, accessory organs can also include the mouth, the tongue, saliva glands of the mouth, but we're going to, for this intents and purposes today, look at the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. We're going to start diving into the alimentary canal, and we're going to talk about this at length in the rest of these slides. So the definition of this canal, it's a mucous membrane lined hollow tube of organs which food passes through and where digestion, mechanical and chemical breakdown occur, and absorption also occurs. It's also where waste is eliminated from. So in order from the most proximal, if you will, it's actually the most cranial, is the mouth, going all the way to the most caudal aspect or the most distal aspect is the anus. So it goes from the mouth to the pharynx to esophagus to stomach to pylorus to small intestine to large intestine to rectum and to anus. And we're going to talk about each of these parts throughout the rest of the slides. You can see from the diagram the order in which they go in. If you look at 10 different websites, you'll see 10 different versions of this same kind of diagram with different labels. And I'm just picking out what I think is the most important pieces for veterinary medicine. That's why I chose this particular one, even though this is actually from a human. This is actually a human alimentary canal that we're seeing in this slide, especially looking at the colon. The colon is one of the biggest differences between the dog and the cat and the human. The colon is not nearly as big in those 2 species, and we can probably talk about why. I want you to think about that. We'll talk about why when we meet together. Okay, so in this alimentary canal, it's, as I said, it's a mucus lined, and most of the canal all has the same anatomy to it. So what you're seeing in that picture is actually a cross section, or like if you took a garden hose and cut it and you're kind of looking down the nozzle of it, and you're seeing the different layers of the canal. So they're tubes, they're empty. So the middle part we call a lumen, and the lumen of anything, you can use lumen in all different paradigms, but we're using it in medicine here. And the lumen is the empty space in the middle of it. So it's a hollow tube. There's nothing in it until we put food in it, and then it becomes not hollow anymore. So the outermost layer of it is called the serosa, which we don't need to know too much about. The next layer is the one I'm more interested in, is muscularis. So muscularis is muscle, right? It's actually the muscle of this canal, and it goes from the esophagus to the stomach to the pylorus all the way down, where it is able to move through a motion called peristalsis that you've probably already heard of, which are muscular contractions along the alimentary tract to move the food through. The submucosal layer is just underneath that. And again, not super interested in that one. It's just another layer. And then the mucosal layer is the innermost layer. So the one that actually comes in contact with the digestia, or the food that's being digested, as it moves through. And this is different in the different parts of the canal. So in the stomach, it looks a lot different than it does in the small intestine, than it does in the esophagus. You get the idea, right? So in some areas, it's absorbing nutrients. In other areas, it's just secreting mucus. In other areas, it's secreting mucus and enzymes, and also like hydrochloric acid, for instance. And then, of course, we already talked about that lumen. And then the lumen can get bigger or smaller, just like a pupil, right? Can get bigger and smaller, depending on how much food is being moved through, how quickly it's going through, and lots of other smaller factors. Within the mouth is where we first start to see the real big difference between mechanical and chemical digestion, or breakdown. So digestion is basically breakdown, right? It's the breakdown of food. So in the mouth, we have both. We have teeth that provide mechanical digestion. So it's actually physically breaking apart the pieces of food into smaller pieces of food. And then we also have salivary glands that actually provide salivary amylase, that is an enzyme that also starts the chemical digestion of food. The other function of salivary glands is to provide lubricant as well, so to moisten the food and to keep it wet, and so it's able to slide down into the rest of the alimentary tract. So the tongue, of course, is there as well. It aids in both propulsion, which is movement, and also of the food bolus, sorry, and it also helps with mixing, so it helps mix in that saliva that's in the mouth. Often you hear about the pharynx. It's this weird idea of what the pharynx is, because it's not really a thing, it's a space. So the pharynx is this open space at the base of the tongue, just before the esophagus. So throughout the slides, we'll talk a lot about some differences and similarities between species. As you know, veterinary medicine students here, we have to learn about all different species. And so, as you already know, the number of teeth actually do vary from species to species. And also the amount of saliva produced and also the enzymes produced vary by species as well. We actually know that the bird doesn't actually produce saliva. And so it is why water is super critical for the digestive process of the bird. So birds actually store their food in their crop, and that's where water will go, right, when they drink water, because they don't actually chew. So everything they eat just gets swallowed whole, and then it goes down into the crop. The gizzard is actually the mouth, quote unquote. It's not really, but it's deep within the animal, but it's where the food is ground up. So that's where mechanical digestion will occur in a bird. So also regurgitation and vomiting also varies by species, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. The esophagus is a soft, flexible tube that's lined with muscles that connects the pharynx area to the stomach. So when food is chewed in the mouth and saliva is mixed in, we call that now a bolus of food. And so that bolus is moved along the esophagus by peristalsis to the stomach. Peristalsis is the muscular contractions that move the food along, or move that bolus of food along. So, fun fact that horses, rabbits, and guinea pigs are all examples of a species that cannot vomit or even eructate. And eructation actually means burping. So their esophagus doesn't allow anything to leave the stomach and go back up into the mouth area, which is just a function of their anatomy. Ruminants, however, can absolutely eructate and do it all the time. They can also regurgitate, and then they remasticate their food. Now, what does that all mean? So regurgitate is a little different than vomiting. It's simply an erping up. So it's just this erp up of food, not a very violent projectile of their food up into their mouth. And that's called cud. So when they bring that up into their mouth, and then they remasticate. So masticate is to chew. Re, of course, is again. So they're chewing their food again, and they're chewing that wad of cud to further break it down so that they can digest it better. Dogs and cats can, of course, vomit, but we need to be worried about that on a routine basis because of their mucosal lining. Just like in humans, it can be damaged by the acid from the stomach. So the stomach is highly acidic, and those fluids can actually hurt the sensitive esophagus because it's not prepared for those kinds of acids. However, the ruminant doesn't bother them at all. They actually have extra mucus, that's the mucus that is on their esophagus. And also when the fluid comes up from their rumen, the pH is not in any way acidic. It's actually a very neutral pH, so it wouldn't hurt them anyway, even if they didn't have that extra coating within their esophagus. So a simple stomach, we're not going to talk in depth about ruminants at this time, or even birds at this time, but just kind of getting the idea of what a simple stomach does in aiding in digestion. So the stomach is lined with mucosa to protect it, a simple stomach, and even cows have a simple stomach as well. It's part of their anatomy. It's lined with mucosa to protect it from all of the acidic juices, fluids that are within the stomach. They also produce enzymes that help digest food along with hydrochloric acid, which is what makes it such a low pH within the stomach. Both of these things, both the digestive enzyme pepsid and hydrochloric acid, help in chemical digestion. It's the first time that chemical digestion really starts to take hold. As the stomach churns around through an act called propulsion, or so it contracts up at the fundus and it pushes its way down through the body, and that mashes the bolus in there around, and then we start to call it chyme, which we'll talk about later. That's C-H-Y-M-E, and chyme is bolus that is now digested even further and broken down into smaller pieces. So when you see your own animal vomit, your dog or cat vomit, you'll see most of the time what they vomit is actually whole kibbles, right? They're not even chewing their food. Where is the mechanical digestion? Well, they don't need it as much with a commercial diet like they eat now. Now, if they were eating out in the wild, they would definitely do more chewing. Most of the chewing is done for them because they have a commercial diet. So that propulsion is created by the smooth muscles, and I have a typo on there, I apologize, it says created, it should be created, sorry about that, but that aids in the mechanical digestion. So the topmost portion of the stomach in all of our species, of the true stomach or simple stomach, is called the fundus, and then the very bottom part, or the most distal part, is called the pylorus. And the pylorus is important in dog and cat because the pylorus is often a spot where we see foreign bodies that they ingest. So things like balls and toys and plastic and batteries and who knows what else gets stuck at the pylorus, because as you can see in the image with the yellow circle there, there's a bend there. And so we often see that items will get stuck there, and that's not a great place for them to get stuck. Because it can actually cause all sorts of problems. So we do worry about that little bend for things to go around if they eat non-food items. So as you probably already remember, ruminants have 4 compartments in their stomach, and birds actually have 2. And the proventriculus acts as their true stomach. So this is where some chemical digestion happens, which is why we call it their true stomach. Cats, dogs, horses, pigs, rabbits, and so many other species all have one simple stomach. So let's look at that small intestine. So we're going to call the small intestine, I'm going to call it, this is me, my personal opinion, the most important part of digestion, because this is where all of the nutrients gets absorbed into the body. So gets absorbed into the bloodstream. There's a lot of small intestine. It's definitely the longest portion of any species. I'm not giving you the feet or meters. You can always look that up, but because it varies so much by species. Humans have a lot. We have a lot. So it starts just after the pylorus. So the pylorus comes off the stomach and meets into the duodenum. And the duodenum is the very beginning, if you will. and probably, I don't know, it's not the most important part. It isn't, because all of the parts of the small intestine are important. So I made this mnemonic, please don't joke in class, which I actually don't mean, because I'm actually love jokes and I think it's really fun. It makes the day go by better. To remember though, pylorus, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and cecum. And that is the order from the end of the stomach to the beginning of the large intestine. So that's the order that the small intestine. So the middle three, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, are the three sections of the small intestine. The duodenum is actually where the pancreas attaches and where digestive juices come in from the liver and the pancreas. And by juices, I mean enzymes. So enzymes that are going to be able to break down the food into the monomers, and they're able to be then digested or absorbed, I'm sorry, by the body. So this is where everything happens that keeps the body alive. Basically, all the pre stuff is breaking it down, breaking it down, breaking it down. And at the very beginning of the duodenum of the small intestine, things are being broken down even more. So we'll talk more about how that happens in a different slide. But things are broken down even more in the duodenum with those digestive enzymes that are brought in, and also bile that's brought in. And then after that, in the jejunum, that's where the bulk of things get absorbed. So the image I have up here, again, is human. But what I wanted to point out is the small intestine here. It shows you, kind of a pullout of it where it says small intestine, cutting it like a garden hose, again, so you can see that middle part like we saw in the other slide of the whole alimentary tract. And then these tiny little folds are so cool. It's so ingenious. So it's villi, they're called villi, and they're not villainous or anything like that. They're great. It increases the surface area of this otherwise already long tube. And so that's why they're there, is that all of those little spicules coming off of the villi are actually where the blood capillaries meet, and they're able to absorb what's come into the body and what's been broken down, and what the nutrients, the building blocks of life, they're able to absorb there. So cool. So very cool. So between all of the species, they're all very similar in structure. Avians are, of course, a little bit different. Reptiles, I'm not even going to discuss, but are pretty similar too. But they're definitely very, very similar throughout all species. Length is going to vary, of course, and then, but other than that, they're pretty similar. Here is an amazing slide that I found. This image of a bisection or cross cut of this of the lumen of the small intestine, and then they've stained it, and then first they've impression smeared it, so they've squished it onto a slide, then they've stained it in Diff Quick, and this is what we're seeing. So we can actually see the cross section here of the villi, and you can see if you were to pull that out, all those little spicules going up and down, you would have this giant long thing, right? You could do that with a string, and you can actually bring the string around, and then you pull it out, you'll see how long your string actually is. So it's just an ingenious way to do all of the absorption that needs to happen. So then there's the colon. We're almost done. Don't worry. I know this is a long show. I'm sorry. This has 4 parts to it: the cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, and descending colon. All of them are colored, and then they're circled here on the side. So the cecum is what comes in, and I told you don't joke in class, right? So is the ileum right before the cecum. So this ileum attaches to the cecum. The cecum is very different in different species. It's different in humans, to dogs, to cats, to rabbits, to horses, to everybody. But the cecum is where it starts. Cecum in the human is also called the appendix. So you probably have heard of that before. Ascending, it goes up. Transverse, it goes across, and descending, it goes down. And this image is actually from a dog. So you can see, remember from the other pictures, it was much bigger in the human. The colon is much smaller in the dog than it is in the human. But the cecum is that circled in purple there. It goes on to the the ascending colon, which goes up a little bit, transverse goes over, and descending goes down. So the layers of this is, again, very similar to that. The small intestine, they don't have as many microvilli, but they do have villi. The primary function is to absorb water in the colon. So the small intestine did all the heavy lifting, did all the hard stuff, and now it sits in the colon. It's now called feces now that it's in the colon. So it moved from chyme to feces, and it's sitting there waiting for water to be absorbed. A small amount of fermentation can happen in here as well. And there's microbes, obviously, we know that, right, within the large intestine, and the undigested ingestia, which is what we call the food that's been ingested, right, that's also happening at this time. So the cecum in the horse, rabbit, and guinea pig, and other species that are called cecal or hind end or hind gut fermenters is very important. This is like the rumen in the cow, so it's where fermentation happens. So it's where they're able to break down the food they eat, which is cellulose based, right? It's all plant material, into usable nutrients. So that process happens within the cecum of the horse and other hindgut fermenters. It's a very important part. Really cool thing is it also is what keeps them warm in the winter. It actually produces, it's endothermic, so it produces a lot of heat as well. The colon does vary in length between species, of course, but it all has similar function, except for that cecum part. The cecum is the exception. So the cecum is huge in a horse. It's several feet long, and it's what they call the fermentation tank for them. And it just does all of the breaking down of their food. So then the very last bits are the rectum and anus. The rectum is the last portion of the colon. It's not technically, it's sort of its own thing, but it's not really, it's all part of one system, obviously, the alimentary canal, but it's the very end part where the stool sits to wait prior to defecation. Small amounts of water are absorbed here, but there are lots of nerve endings in this area, and once it reaches a certain capacity, that's when it gives the brain a signal that now the anal sphincters need to relax and need to let defecation happen, which is the passage of stool out of the body. The rectum does vary in length between mammalian species, but it's pretty similar throughout. The bird, however, has a cloaca and not a rectum. So the cloaca of the bird is actually just vestibule at the very end of both the reproductive, the urinary, and the digestive tracts. All come into the same spot. So this is where feces, urine, and eggs pass through on the way out of the body. So the cloaca is the rectum, if you will, of the avian.